Hey, before we begin, if you find yourself drifting off to this one, that means we're doing something right. Take a moment to like the video if you enjoy this kind of calm, historical storytelling, and subscribe if you want more, only if it genuinely resonates with you. Drop a comment and let us know where you heard about this video, a friend, a search at midnight, a recommendation that led you here at the end of a long day. We love knowing how you found your way. Now, turn down the lights, get comfortable, and let's go back, a very long way back, to a world where the sun was a god, the river was a god, and the man sitting on the golden throne was something more than human. Picture Egypt before the pyramids stood fully formed against the sky, the Nile Valley, green and narrow, threading through an immense desert that stretched in every direction to the horizon. In the early morning, before the heat had fully arrived, the river moved silently southward, its surface catching the first pale light. Egrets stood at the water's edge. Farmers moved into fields that were dark and rich from the receding flood. And somewhere, in a palace whose walls were painted the deep ochre and blue of the river world, a man was being woken by attendants before the sun had fully risen. Not because it was convenient, but because everything depended on it. This was Egypt, and this was the pharaoh. When most people imagine an ancient Egyptian pharaoh, they picture the golden death mask of Tutankhamun, or a stone colossus staring into the desert, or perhaps a figure seated on a monumental throne, surrounded by incense and ritual and the weight of divine authority. These images are not wrong, but they are incomplete. The real lives of Egypt's pharaohs were more demanding, more complicated, more human, and in many ways more extraordinary than the monuments they left behind suggest. Across roughly 3,000 years of continuous civilization, one of the longest lasting in all of human history, the pharaohs were the still point around which everything else moved. The state, the economy, the religion, the very functioning of the natural world as Egyptians understood it, depended on the pharaoh getting it right. Tonight, we step behind the monuments and explore what that actually meant. To understand the pharaoh, you first need to understand how a child born into the royal house was prepared to become one. Most pharaohs came from within the royal family, though the specific rules of succession shifted over the 3,000-year span of Egyptian civilization. And not every pharaoh was the eldest son of the previous king. What remained consistent was the intensive preparation of the heir. From early childhood, a prince who was expected to one day rule would receive an education unlike anything available to ordinary Egyptians. This was not merely a matter of learning administrative skills or military tactics, though both were included. It was an education in the cosmos itself, as Egyptians understood it. Reading and writing hieroglyphics was the foundation. The hieroglyphic script was not the simplified alphabet that later languages would develop, but a complex system of hundreds of symbols that required years of dedicated study to master. Scribes and priests served as tutors, and the sessions were rigorous. A prince who could not write with precision and fluency could not function in the administrative world that awaited him. Alongside hieroglyphics came mathematics, essential for managing the vast resources of the kingdom, and medicine, which was intertwined with religious knowledge and Egyptian understanding. The prince studied theology, the intricate relationships between the gods, the myths that explained the world's creation and ongoing order, the prayers and ritual texts he would one day be required to perform. And he trained in physical disciplines, archery, chariot driving, swimming, and the basics of combat, because the pharaoh was also, in principle, the supreme military commander of Egypt's armies, the vizier, the highest official in the Egyptian state, who managed the entire bureaucracy in the pharaoh's name, sometimes served as a kind of senior advisor during this period of royal education. Priests of the great temples, men who had dedicated decades to mastering the sacred knowledge of particular gods, taught the heir the rituals he would need to perform. And older men of the court, veterans of previous reigns, transmitted the accumulated practical wisdom of governance in a civilization that had been running continuously for centuries by the time any given prince was born. What this education was ultimately preparing the prince for was not merely kingship in the political sense. It was something more demanding. It was divinity on earth. The concept of the pharaoh's divine nature was one of the most fundamental organizing principles of Egyptian civilization. The pharaoh was not merely a king in the way that later cultures understood kingship. He was the living embodiment of the god Horus, the falcon-headed deity of kingship in the sky. And upon death, he became Osiris, the god of the dead in the afterlife. He was the son of Ra, the sun god, whose daily journey across the sky the pharaoh's own daily rituals were understood to support and perpetuate. He was the mortal guarantor of Ma'at, the Egyptian concept of cosmic order, balance, truth, and justice, a concept so central to Egyptian civilization that it was personified as a goddess wearing a single ostrich feather in her headdress. The idea that the pharaoh maintained Ma'at was not metaphorical. Egyptians genuinely believed that the pharaoh's performance of the correct rituals, the proper offering of worship to the gods, and the righteous exercise of royal power were what kept the cosmos in its proper arrangement. The sun rose each morning because the pharaoh had performed his rituals. The Nile flooded each year, bringing the fertile black silt that made Egyptian agriculture possible, because the pharaoh had maintained his relationship with the gods. If a pharaoh neglected his duties, if he failed to offer correctly, if he allowed corruption and injustice to flourish, the consequences would not be limited to political instability. The cosmic order itself was at risk. This was not an abstract concern. It was the animating belief of everyone in Egypt, from the highest official to the humblest farmer. A pharaoh's day began before dawn. The morning rituals were the most sacred and most demanding of his daily obligations. While ordinary Egyptians were waking and beginning their work, the pharaoh had already entered the private sanctuary of the temple. He had been bathed and purified by attendants in water that was understood to carry sacred properties. He had been dressed in fine white linen, the material associated with purity and divine service, and adorned with his ceremonial beard, his crown, and the other regalia that marked his divine office. The specific crown varied: the white crown of Upper Egypt, the red crown of Lower Egypt, the double crown that combined both to represent the unified kingdom, the elaborate Atap crown with its feathers and sun disk for certain religious occasions. Each carried specific symbolic weight and was worn at appropriate moments. Once prepared, he entered the inner sanctuary of the temple, where the cult statue of the god resided. The statue was understood not as a representation of the deity, but as the actual residence of the god's divine presence on earth. The pharaoh, theoretically the only person in Egypt truly authorized to communicate directly with the gods, would break the clay seal on the shrine's doors, open them, and wake the god. He would anoint the statue with sacred oils, dress it in fresh linen, and present it with a morning meal of bread, beer, and fruit. This act of feeding the god was the most important ritual of the day. By nourishing the divine presence, the pharaoh renewed the cosmic covenant that kept Egypt functioning, that ensured the sun would continue its journey, the river would continue to yield. Of course, the pharaoh could not personally perform these morning rituals in every temple in Egypt simultaneously. Egypt was a large and complex civilization, with temples in every major city. The solution was that high priests served as the pharaoh's designated representatives in most temples for most of the year, performing the rituals in his name. But the pharaoh's personal performance of key rituals at the most important temples, Karnak, Luxor, Abydos, Memphis, was understood to carry a power that delegation could not fully replicate. And in his own palace sanctuary, the pharaoh performed his morning rituals himself each day. It was the first and most essential task of the waking hours. After the gods had been served, the day's governmental work began. The administrative machinery of ancient Egypt was one of the most sophisticated in the ancient world, a civilization stretching the full length of the Nile Valley, managing the annual flood cycles, coordinating large-scale agricultural production, collecting and redistributing taxes paid in grain and goods, overseeing enormous construction projects, maintaining diplomatic relationships with neighbors near and distant, administering justice, managing the military. All of this required a vast and specialized bureaucracy. At the center of that bureaucracy sat the pharaoh, and at the pharaoh's right hand sat the vizier. The vizier, whose title in ancient Egyptian was Tati, was the highest official in the kingdom and effectively the head of government in practical terms. There were sometimes two viziers simultaneously, one for Upper Egypt and one for Lower Egypt, reflecting the kingdom's ancient division. The vizier oversaw the treasury, the granaries, the legal system, the management of agricultural land, the execution of royal decrees, and the supervision of all other government officials. He was, in a very real sense, the person who made the administrative machine run. Every morning, the vizier received reports from officials throughout the kingdom and brought the most significant matters before the pharaoh. Every significant legal decision ultimately flowed to the vizier's office. It was a position of enormous power and responsibility, and holders of the office were chosen for competence and loyalty rather than birth. In his great audience hall, the pharaoh presided over the daily business of governance. Officials presented reports on the state of the granaries, on the progress of construction projects, on matters of diplomatic relations with foreign powers. Petitions were heard. Egypt had a tradition of ordinary people being able to bring legal grievances before royal officials, and in principle, the most significant cases could reach the pharaoh himself. Tax assessments were reviewed. Disputes between high-ranking nobles were adjudicated. Military officers reported on the state of the army. Governors of the various nomes, the administrative districts into which Egypt was divided, sent regular dispatches. The pharaoh was not merely a ceremonial figurehead presiding over this apparatus. He was the ultimate decision-maker, the source from which law and policy flowed, the final authority in every dispute and every major choice the kingdom faced. The physical world the pharaoh inhabited was extraordinary. The great palaces of ancient Egypt, particularly those of the New Kingdom, the period of greatest prosperity and imperial expansion running roughly from 1550 to 1070 BCE, were architectural achievements that announced the pharaoh's divine status to everyone who entered. The palace of Amenhotep III, at a site known today as Malkata, covered more than 30,000 square meters and contained spacious apartments, conference rooms, audience chambers, a throne room, and receiving hall, a festival hall, gardens, libraries, storerooms, kitchens, a harem, and a temple to the god Ammon. Its outer walls were painted a bright white that caught the Egyptian sunlight with dazzling effect, while the interior was vibrant with blues and yellows and greens. In its day, it was known as the House of Rejoicing. The floors of important ceremonial spaces were sometimes painted with images of bound captives and foreign enemies, so that the pharaoh literally walked on the subjugated peoples of the world with every step. The pharaoh's personal appearance was maintained by a large staff of attendants. His clothing was always fine white linen, supplemented for ceremonial occasions with garments embroidered with gold thread and inlaid with semi-precious stones. Gold was not merely a valuable material in ancient Egypt. It was the flesh of the gods, associated with the immortal and incorruptible. The pharaoh's jewelry, crowns, and regalia incorporated gold extensively, along with carnelian, lapis lazuli, turquoise, and faience. The false beard worn during official ceremonies, though artificial, was a sacred symbol of royal and divine authority. Even the female pharaoh Hatshepsut wore it in her official depictions. Kohl lined the eyes, both for cosmetic effect and for religious purposes, and fragrant oils were applied to the skin. The royal meals were unlike anything available to ordinary Egyptians. The tables of the pharaoh were loaded with bread of many types. Egypt was one of the ancient world's great bread cultures, with records suggesting hundreds of distinct bread varieties, alongside roasted meats, poultry, fish from the Nile, vegetables from royal gardens, fruits including figs, dates, and pomegranates, honey cakes, and wine from the Delta vineyards. Beer, the universal drink of Egypt, was present in the finest qualities. Live animals were kept in palace gardens and slaughtered as needed for fresh meat. The contrast with the diet of ordinary Egyptians, primarily bread, beer, onions, and whatever they could grow in their small plots, was total. Music accompanied the palace's daily life. Egyptian art is filled with images of musicians performing at royal banquets and religious ceremonies, harpists, lutanists, singers, flautists, sistrum players, percussion musicians. Dancing was a regular feature of palace entertainment, and professional dancers of great skill were employed at court. Board games were played during leisure hours. The game of Senet, a kind of racing board game with religious dimensions related to the journey through the afterlife, was popular among all classes, but especially at the royal level, with elaborately decorated sets made of precious materials. Royal gardens provided spaces of beauty and contemplation, planted with trees, watered by channels fed from the Nile, stocked with pools where lotus flowers floated and fish moved through the clear water. The pharaoh hunted. This was not mere leisure, but a demonstration of royal power. The pharaoh's mastery over wild animals reflected his mastery over chaos, his maintenance of order against the forces of nature. Tomb paintings and temple reliefs show pharaohs hunting lions, bulls, ostriches, and hippopotamuses. Ramses II was depicted hunting lions with apparent enthusiasm, though the degree to which such scenes were literal documentation versus symbolic statements is always a question in Egyptian royal imagery. Managing Egypt required not only administrative skill, but an intimate understanding of the Nile's rhythms. The annual flood was the cornerstone of Egyptian civilization. Without it, the agricultural system collapsed. The flood deposited the black silt that replenished the soil's fertility and allowed the remarkable yields that supported one of the ancient world's densest populations. Too little flooding meant famine. Too much could destroy villages and infrastructure. The pharaoh's administration maintained a network of nilometers, measuring stations along the river, that tracked the flood's progress and allowed advanced planning for the distribution of resources. Tax assessments were calculated based on the flood level, with good flood years generating higher agricultural yields and therefore higher tax obligations, and poor flood years resulting in tax reductions to prevent peasant communities from being destroyed. The management of agricultural surplus was one of the state's most important functions. Egypt produced far more grain than its population consumed in good years, and this surplus was stored in state granaries, administered by the pharaoh's officials. In years of poor harvests, the reserves were distributed to prevent famine. The surpluses also allowed Egypt to trade with neighboring regions, acquiring through commerce and tribute the materials it lacked domestically. Cedar wood from Lebanon for ships and construction, copper from Sinai, gold from Nubia, lapis lazuli from distant Central Asia, exotic animals from the land the Egyptians called Punt, somewhere along the African coast south of Egypt. The building projects that the pharaohs commissioned were expressions of theological ambition that required extraordinary organizational capacity. The great temples of Egypt, Karnak, Luxor, Abu Simbel, Edfu, Medinet Habu, and dozens of others, were not merely architectural achievements. They were cosmic statements, physical expressions of the pharaoh's relationship with the gods and of Egypt's position in the divine order. Karnak, the temple complex dedicated primarily to the god Amun at Thebes, was expanded and elaborated by successive pharaohs over a period of more than 2,000 years, becoming one of the largest religious complexes ever built by human hands. Its hypostyle hall, a forest of 134 massive columns, the tallest reaching 21 meters in height, was conceived and built under the pharaohs Seti I and Ramesses II. Walking through it, even in its ruined state today, produces a physical sensation that goes beyond admiration for engineering skill. It produces something closer to awe. The pyramids, of course, were the most famous expression of this building impulse. The Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza, built around 2560 BCE, stands approximately 138 meters high today, somewhat reduced from its original height of 147 meters. It contains an estimated 2.3 million stone blocks, with an average weight of roughly 2.5 tons each. The precision of its construction The base is leveled within 2.1 centimeters across its entire 230-meter length, is a testimony to the mathematical and organizational capabilities of the state that produced it. The pyramids were not built by slaves, despite the popular myth. Archaeological evidence, including the remains of worker villages, payroll records, and injury documentation, suggests that the workforce was composed primarily of skilled and semi-skilled paid laborers, organized in rotating gangs. Workers who were fed, housed, provided with medical care, and buried with honor if they died on the job. The pyramid's purpose was specific and theological. It was the vehicle for the pharaoh's resurrection and ascension to the afterlife. Its shape may have represented the primordial mound of creation that emerged from the waters of chaos at the beginning of the world, or the rays of the sun descending to earth, or both, simultaneously. Egyptian symbolism was comfortable with multiple meanings existing in the same form. The pyramid pointed the dead pharaoh toward the circumpolar stars, which never set, which were therefore immortal, which were therefore the appropriate destination for the divine king. In the New Kingdom, the Great Pyramids were abandoned in favor of rock-cut tombs in the Valley of the Kings, a remote valley on the west bank of the Nile near Thebes. The change was driven by practical considerations. The pyramids, being highly visible, had proven magnets for tomb robbers over the centuries, and the royal mummies and their treasures had repeatedly been violated. The Valley of the Kings, though less architecturally dramatic, offered concealment. Over 60 royal tombs have been discovered there. The most famous, KV-62, belonged to Tutankhamun, and its extraordinary contents, more than 5,000 objects including the famous golden death mask, give us the most complete surviving picture of what a pharaoh was meant to take into eternity. The pharaoh was also Egypt's supreme military commander, at least in principle, and in the periods of greatest imperial expansion, the principle was exercised in person. Egypt's military organization grew and changed over the long span of the civilization. In the Old Kingdom, which saw the construction of the Great Pyramids, the pharaohs maintained a standing army that was primarily defensive and focused on protecting Egypt's borders and securing Nubia's gold and resources. By the New Kingdom, beginning around 1550 BCE, after Egypt had expelled the Hyksos, foreign rulers who had controlled the Nile Delta for more than a century, the military became an instrument of imperial expansion. Thutmose III, who ruled from around 1479 to 1425 BCE, is sometimes called the Napoleon of the ancient world. He led 17 military campaigns into the Levant and Nubia, extending Egyptian power from the Fourth Cataract of the Nile in the south to the banks of the Euphrates in the north. His victory at the Battle of Megiddo in 1457 BCE, in which he outmaneuvered a coalition of Canaanite princes by taking a narrow and dangerous mountain pass that his advisors had recommended avoiding, was celebrated with inscriptions at Karnak that run to more than 200 lines of text. Thutmose III was a genuine military commander, leading his armies from the front, present at the moments of decision, making tactical choices that the evidence suggests were his own, rather than his generals'. Ramses II, who ruled from 1279 to 1213 BCE, one of the longest reigns in Egyptian history, built his military reputation most dramatically at the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE, fought against the Hittite Empire in what is now Syria. The battle was the largest chariot engagement in ancient history, with some 5,000, 6,000 chariots engaged on both sides. Ramses, who had advanced ahead of his main army, relying on false intelligence about the Hittites' position, found himself nearly surrounded, according to the Egyptian account, which Ramses had carved on temple walls from Abu Simbel to Memphis. In an act of extraordinary royal propaganda, he personally charged the enemy lines in his chariot, called upon the god Amon for assistance, and drove back the Hittites through individual heroism until his scattered forces could regroup. The reality, as historians have pieced it together from both Egyptian and Hittite sources, was more complicated. The battle was a tactical stalemate, with neither side achieving decisive victory. Ramesses withdrew. Kadesh remained in Hittite hands. The The peace treaty eventually negotiated between Ramesses and the Hittite king Hattusili III, around 1259 BCE, is the oldest peace treaty in recorded history. A copy hangs in the United Nations building in New York. What Ramesses understood brilliantly was not just warfare, but the art of constructing his own image. No pharaoh built more monuments to himself than Ramesses II, a fact acknowledged by Egyptologists with a kind of awed exasperation. His cartouche appears on temples built by his predecessors, inscribed over the original owner's name. His colossal statues were erected throughout Egypt and Nubia. His victories, embellished to varying degrees, were commemorated in relief carvings on every temple he touched. He outlived most of his children, celebrated 13 or 14 said festivals, the Jubilee ceremony traditionally celebrated after 30 years on the throne, commemorating the pharaoh's renewed vitality, and died at an estimated age of 90 to 91 after a reign of 67 years. He was worshipped as a god during his own lifetime, something reserved for very few pharaohs. When his mummy was examined by modern scientists, it showed severe arthritis, dental problems, and the physical accumulation of a very long life well used. There was a dimension to the pharaoh's power that went beyond the administrative and the religious, the power of image, of representation, of carefully constructed narrative. Egyptian royal art was not documentary. It was propaganda in the most intentional sense, designed to reinforce the pharaoh's divine authority and his military supremacy. To present the king as the ideal ruler, whose every victory was cosmically ordained, and whose every monument was an act of piety rather than ambition. Temple reliefs showing the pharaoh in his chariot, single-handedly routing masses of enemies while his soldiers watched from a safe distance, were not meant to be taken as literal transcripts of battle. They were symbolic statements about the nature of royal power. The pharaoh stands alone because the pharaoh acts in conjunction with the gods. His enemies fall because chaos cannot prevail against the embodiment of order. This understanding of royal imagery helps explain why Ramesses II could add the same victory scene, himself in his chariot, enemies tumbling before him, reproduced on temple walls from one end of his kingdom to the other, and why that scene remained meaningful, even though anyone with knowledge of the actual Battle of Kadesh knew it had ended inconclusively. The scene was not about Kadesh specifically. It was about the eternal truth that the pharaoh, as the representative of Ma'at, always ultimately prevails over the forces of chaos. Historical truth and symbolic truth were different categories, and royal art operated in the symbolic register. The pharaoh's family life was as complex as the civilization he governed. The great royal wife held a specific and important position in the court. She was not simply the pharaoh's primary consort, but a ritual participant in her own right, present at ceremonies, depicted in temple reliefs, sometimes shown as a smaller figure beside the pharaoh, but always present. Nefertari, the beloved first wife of Ramses II, was honored with one of the two temples at Abu Simbel, the smaller temple. Certainly, but its quality of art is generally considered superior to the larger. The inscriptions make Ramesses' feeling for her explicit in a way rare in royal records. She, for whom the sun shines. Beyond the great royal wife, pharaohs maintained the institution known as the harem, not in the later Ottoman sense, but as a separate residential compound for the pharaoh's other wives, their children, and their attendants. The New Kingdom harem at Garob in the Fayoum was a substantial establishment, with its own administrative structure and workshops. The women who lived there were not necessarily prisoners. Some were daughters of foreign rulers, sent to Egypt as diplomatic gifts. Others were Egyptian women of high birth. Their children, if male, were potential heirs, which is where the politics became complicated, and sometimes multiple sons of different mothers, all with theoretical claims to the throne, created a competitive environment that could turn lethal. Inscriptions and archaeological evidence record at least one known conspiracy, the harem conspiracy against Ramesses III, in which a wife and her son attempted to assassinate the pharaoh and seize the throne. The conspiracy was discovered and prosecuted in a trial whose papyrus records have survived, giving us an extraordinary window into royal palace intrigue 3,000 years ago, certain pharaohs stand so far apart from their contemporaries that they require individual attention. Hatshepsut, who ruled from roughly 1479 to 1458 BCE, began her reign as regent for her young stepson Thutmose III, who had inherited the throne as a small child. Within a few years, she had assumed the full titulary of pharaoh. The 5 names that constituted the royal name, the uraeus cobra on the crown, the false beard, the full ceremonial regalia. In her official depictions, she is shown as physically male, though the accompanying texts sometimes shift between masculine and feminine pronouns in ways that suggest those responsible for the inscriptions understood the reality. She was not the first woman to rule Egypt, but she was the most successful, reigning for more than 20 years and presiding over one of the most prosperous periods in Egyptian history. She sent the famous expedition to the land of Punt, which returned with 31 living myrrh trees, mounds of precious resins, ebony, gold, and animals. She built the magnificent mortuary temple at Deir al-Bahari, which stands today as one of the most beautiful architectural achievements of the ancient world. After her death, Thutmose III, who had been waiting, with whatever combination of patience and frustration, through more than 20 years of her reign, ordered the systematic erasure of her name and image from monuments throughout Egypt. Her statues were smashed and thrown into a pit. Her name was chiseled from inscriptions. It was only in the modern era, as Egyptologists learned to read the hieroglyphic record with greater precision, that Hatshepsut's true identity and achievements were recovered from the deliberate obscurity to which her successor had consigned them. Akhenaten, who ruled from approximately 1353 to 1336 BCE, undertook what is arguably the most radical religious revolution in Egyptian history. Born Amenhotep IV, he early in his reign abandoned the worship of the traditional Egyptian pantheon and declared that only one god, the Aten, the disk of the sun itself, not the anthropomorphic sun god Ra, but the physical light itself, was the true deity. He closed the great temples of Amun and the other gods, redirecting their vast resources to the Aten's worship. He changed his own name to Akhenaten, meaning one effective for the Aten. He built an entirely new capital city in Middle Egypt, calling it Akhetaten, Horizon of the Aten, the site known today as Tel El Amarna. The art of his reign was unlike anything that came before it or after, elongated, intimate, showing the royal family in informal poses, children being kissed and held, the pharaoh and his wife Nefertiti receiving the Aten's rays that end in small human hands offering life. It has the quality of a private world made public, personal theology expressed through state art. Whether Akhenaten's revolution was genuine religious conviction or political strategy to break the power of the Amun priesthood, which by his reign controlled enormous wealth and land, is a question historians continue to debate. What is not in question is that after his death, the revolution was rapidly reversed. His city was abandoned. His temples were dismantled. His name was erased from the official records, following the same process that had removed Hatshepsut. His young son, who had grown up in the new city, under the new religion, with the name Tutankhaten meaning living image of the Aten, hanged his name to Tutankhamen and moved the capital back to Thebes, restoring the old gods to their former prominence. Tutankhamen died around age 19, after a reign of approximately 9 years. His tomb, discovered intact by Howard Carter in 1922, contained objects of astonishing beauty and historical significance. The golden death mask, golden shrines nested within each other like an elaborate puzzle, canopic jars holding his preserved organs, chariots, weapons, furniture, games, food, wine, clothing for eternity. He was a minor king in historical terms. He is the best-known pharaoh in the world, the single greatest preoccupation of every pharaoh's life, arguably more urgent than governance, more consuming than military campaigning, more demanding than the daily rituals, was the preparation for death. This is not because ancient Egyptians were morbid or fearful. The evidence suggests quite the opposite. They loved life deeply, and their preparation for death was an expression of that love. They prepared so carefully, precisely because they believed that death, properly navigated, was not an ending, but a transformation, a passage from mortal life to a form of existence that was, if anything, more real and more permanent than the brief span of years on Earth. The Pharaoh, as a being who was simultaneously human and divine, had a particular relationship with this passage. His death was not merely a personal event. It was a cosmic event, a moment in the eternal cycle of existence that required the proper forms be observed exactly and with complete care. The process of mummification took 70 days and was performed by specialized priests known as embalmers, working in an installation called the Beautiful House. The number 70 was not arbitrary. It corresponded to the 70 days that the star Sothis, which we know as Sirius, disappeared below the horizon before its annual rising, which coincided with the beginning of the Nile flood. The entire cycle of death, preservation, and rebirth was aligned with the rhythms of the natural world. The process began with the removal of the internal organs, which would decay rapidly if left in the body. The brain was removed first, inserted through the nasal passage using specialized hooked instruments, pulled out in fragments and discarded. The Egyptians did not regard the brain as the seat of intelligence or consciousness. That was the heart, which was left in place within the body as the center of the person's identity, and the organ that would be judged in the afterlife. The stomach, lungs, liver, and intestines were removed through an incision in the left side of the abdomen, treated separately, wrapped in linen, and placed in 4 stone or alabaster containers called canopic jars. Each jar was protected by one of the 4 sons of the god Horus, depicted as a head on the jar's stopper: the human-headed Imseti for the liver, the baboon-headed Hapi for the lungs, the falcon-headed Kibe Senuef for the intestines, and the jackal-headed Duamatef for the stomach. The body was then packed in and covered with natron, a naturally occurring salt found in dry lake beds in Egypt, which drew out moisture and prevented bacterial decay. It lay in natron for approximately 40 days, after which it was dried, shrunken, leathered, preserved against time. The body was then washed, anointed with sacred oils, stuffed with dry materials to restore its shape, and wrapped in hundreds of meters of fine linen bandages applied in precise patterns. Between the layers, priests placed amulets, small objects of protective power, the heart scarab to guard against any accusation in the afterlife judgment, the jade pillar symbolizing stability, the ankh of life, figures of protective deities, prayers and spells from what we call the Book of the Dead, the collection of magical texts that guided the deceased through the dangers of the underworld, were written on the linen itself. The completed mummy was placed in a series of nested coffins. For a pharaoh, the innermost coffin was often solid gold. Tutankhamun's inner coffin weighed approximately 110 kilograms of solid gold. The succession of coffins was placed within a stone sarcophagus, and everything was assembled within the burial chamber of the tomb, which had been under construction for years or even decades during the pharaoh's lifetime. The belief about what awaited the pharaoh after death was one of the most elaborately developed afterlife theologies in human history. The soul had multiple components in Egyptian understanding. The Ka was the life force, or double, a spiritual duplicate of the person that required the physical body to have a home and depended on offerings to be sustained. The Ba was something more like what we would call the personality or individual identity, depicted as a human-headed bird. It could fly out of the tomb and move about the world during the day, but needed to return to the body each night. The Ak was the transfigured spirit that resulted from the successful completion of the afterlife journey. Immortal, powerful, dwelling among the gods and the stars. The journey to become Ak was not automatic or guaranteed. It required passing through the dangers of the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, a complex realm of gates, guardians, and trials, all of which required the correct knowledge of prayers, passwords, and ritual actions to navigate successfully. The Book of the Dead was precisely this knowledge, compiled for the journey. At the end of the journey stood the Hall of Two Truths, where the deceased's heart was weighed on a scale against the feather of Maat, the symbol of truth and cosmic balance. if the heart was lighter than the feather, pure of sin and full of righteous deeds, the person passed into eternal life in the field of reeds, an idealized version of the Egyptian countryside, where they would live forever in beauty and abundance. If the heart was heavier, it was devoured by the monster on it, part lion, part hippopotamus, part crocodile, and the person simply ceased to exist. For the pharaoh, the journey had an additional dimension. He was not merely traveling to the field of reeds. He was becoming Osiris, the god of the dead, taking his place in the divine realm that governed the afterlife. His son, the new pharaoh, by performing the opening of the mouth ceremony on his mummified father's body, touching the mouth, eyes, ears, and nose with special instruments to restore the senses for the eternal life ahead, enacted the role of Horus, the living king, restoring life to Osiris, the dead king. The transition of power was understood as a reenactment of the cosmic myth in which Horus avenged the murder of his father Osiris and restored order to the world. The question of what ended the pharaonic civilization is not simple, because what ended it was not a single catastrophe, but the gradual accumulation of pressures over centuries. By the late period, beginning around 664 BCE, Egypt had been invaded and temporarily ruled by foreign powers on multiple occasions. The Assyrians, the Nubians who came from the south to form Egypt's 25th dynasty, and who, paradoxically, were among the most enthusiastic restorers of traditional Egyptian culture, the Persians, under Cambyses, who conquered Egypt in 525 BCE. Each of these foreign rulers adapted to Egyptian royal tradition to varying degrees, adopting the title of pharaoh and following the rituals as best they could. The fundamental idea of the pharaoh persisted even as the specific bloodlines changed. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, he was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule. He visited the oracle of Amun at Siwa, who reportedly confirmed his divine nature. He was shown respect by the Egyptian priests, who recognized in the conquering Macedonian general the essential structure of the pharaoh, persisted even as the specific bloodlines changed. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, he was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule. He visited the oracle of Amun at Siwa, who reportedly confirmed his divine nature. He was shown respect by the Egyptian priests, who recognized in the conquering Macedonian general the essential structure of the pharaoh, a powerful ruler who would maintain the temples, perform the rituals, and maintain Ma'at. Alexander died in 323 BCE without ever returning to Egypt. One of his generals, Ptolemy, took control of Egypt and eventually declared himself Ptolemy I, founding the dynasty that would bear his name. The Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, until 30 BCE. They were Macedonian Greeks, and for most of the dynasty's history, they governed from Alexandria, the magnificent city Alexander had founded on the Mediterranean coast, which became one of the ancient world's great centers of learning, trade, and culture. The earlier Ptolemies left the Egyptian temple administration largely intact and were depicted in the traditional pharaonic style on temple walls, though most of them never learned the Egyptian language and never fully embraced Egyptian culture as their own. Cleopatra VII was different. Born in 69 BCE and ascending to the throne at 18, she was the first Ptolemaic ruler to learn the Egyptian language, and indeed was reported to speak 9 languages in total, including Greek, Latin, and several of the languages of Egypt's eastern neighbors. She presented herself as a true Egyptian queen, performing the rituals, engaging with the priests, appearing in the traditional iconography. Her political intelligence was remarkable. In a period when Rome was a dominant power in the Mediterranean world and Egypt's independence was perpetually at risk, she managed, through a combination of genuine capability, diplomatic skill, and her relationships with Julius Caesar and then Mark Antony, to maintain Egyptian autonomy for decades. When Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, defeated her and Antony at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE and invaded Egypt the following year, she took her own life on the 10th or 12th of August, 30 BCE. She was 39 years old. Her death, ended the Ptolemaic dynasty. Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire. The long, extraordinary era of the pharaohs was over, but not entirely, not in the way that matters most. When Octavian took control of Egypt, the Egyptian priests still needed a pharaoh. Their religious understanding of the world required a divine king who maintained the relationship between heaven and earth, who performed the rituals, who guaranteed the flood and the harvest and the rising of the sun. Octavian, as the ruler of Egypt, was given a cartouche and incorporated into the temple iconography. Roman emperors after him were depicted on Egyptian temple walls in the traditional pharaonic style, making offerings to the Egyptian gods, wearing the double crown. The form persisted even after the content had changed utterly. The last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 CE at a small temple on the island of Philae, more than 400 years after Cleopatra's death. The tradition was resilient to the end. What the pharaohs left behind is extraordinary in ways that go beyond the obvious and the visible. The pyramids and temples are the most visible legacy, and their visual power is never diminished. The Great Pyramid of Giza was the tallest human-made structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years. Karnak Temple Complex is among the largest religious structures ever built. Abu Simbel, the temple that Ramses II carved into a Nubian cliff face, was relocated in a modern engineering operation in the 1960s to save it from flooding by the Aswan Dam, a project that itself reflected the ancient power of Egyptian monuments to compel extraordinary effort from later civilizations. But the legacy goes deeper than stone. The religious ideas developed in ancient Egypt, the concept of a divine king who mediated between heaven and earth, the elaborate theology of death and resurrection embodied in the myths of Osiris, the idea that the physical body must be preserved for the soul to survive into eternity. These ideas left traces in the religious traditions that came after them. The careful, systematic observation of the natural world that underlay Egyptian astronomy and mathematics contributed to the knowledge that was eventually systemized and expanded in the Greek intellectual tradition. The administrative techniques that managed one of the ancient world's most complex states influenced the bureaucratic traditions of later empires. The civilization that the pharaohs built lasted, in some form, for approximately 3,000 years. To put that in context, roughly the same amount of time separates us from the Battle of Kadesh as separated the Battle of Kadesh from the construction of Stonehenge. The pharaohs presided over a civilization of such duration and continuity that its internal history is richer and more complex than the entire recorded history of most modern nations. 3,000 years of art, of religion, of science, of administration, of war and peace, and famine and plenty, all flowing through the extraordinary institution of the pharaoh, the living God on earth, the son of Ra, the keeper of Maat, the mortal man who carried on his shoulders the weight of the cosmos. Consider what that means concretely. When Ramses II was born, the pyramids of Giza were already more than 1,000 years old. When Cleopatra walked the streets of Alexandria, she was separated from Ramesses by the same distance that separates us from the early medieval period in Europe. The span of Egyptian civilization dwarfs that of Rome. It dwarfs the entire period from the fall of Rome to today. It is a length of continuous, recorded, organized human civilization that has no parallel anywhere in the world. They were born into extraordinary expectation. They were trained from childhood for an impossible role. They spent their days performing sacred rituals before dawn, hearing petitions and managing disputes, overseeing construction projects, reviewing tax assessments, planning military campaigns, and maintaining the complex web of divine and political relationships on which everything depended. They died, and their bodies were preserved through a 70-day process of extraordinary care. And they were placed in tombs whose walls were covered with spells and maps for the journey ahead. And they were surrounded with the objects they would need in a life beyond life. Some of them were great warriors. Some were gentle administrators. Some were revolutionary dreamers. Some were children who died before their time. Some were erased from the record by jealous successors and rediscovered 3,000 years later. All of them carried, with whatever degree of personal success or failure, the weight of a civilization's trust that the world would continue to function because they had gotten out of bed before dawn and done what the gods required. Let that settle around you now. Let the Nile move quietly in the darkness beyond the palace walls, and the stars of the Egyptian night turn slowly overhead, and the pharaoh's lamp burn low in the sanctuary after the morning rituals are complete. 3,000 years is a very long time to maintain a civilization, and yet they did it. These men and women in their golden crowns and fine linen, their faces staring outward from stone forever, patient, commanding, impossibly enduring. If tonight's quiet walk through the world of the pharaohs gave you something to hold on to as you drift, a sense of the vast depth of human history, the particular weight that comes from standing before something ancient and true, please consider leaving a like and subscribe if you haven't already. It helps this channel reach more people who might need exactly this kind of company at the end of a long day. We'll be here next time, somewhere further back in time, and just as close to home. Sleep well. The sun will rise again. And somewhere beneath the desert sands, in painted chambers that have waited 3,000 years and more, the pharaohs still keep their vigil, surrounded by the objects of eternity, their names carved in stone that has outlasted every empire that came after them, patient and permanent in the darkness, exactly as they intended.